Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Glad to be joined today by Texas Politics Project Research Director Josh Blank. 2 days after what has felt at times like the longest primary season in Texas history. Now, this is a subjective rather than an empirical judgment, but nonetheless.
I was going to say, are there a lot of people out there?
I don't know if I don't think I'm the only one that feels that way, but.
Well, I mean, given all the journalists we talked to, I can tell you for a fact that there's not a journalist I've talked to who doesn't feel like this has been going on forever. This point. And I mean, I don't know. I certainly feel like, I'll say this. I can't imagine there are a lot of Texans out there who are like, damn, I wish this were still going on. I wish these guys were still fighting it out because this has been great, you know?
So, I was thinking of starting with a recap, but I don't know that we actually really need to do that. I mean, I think, if you're listening, you know who the winners were. If we were to go just in quick order, Paxton beats Cornyn by a lot, which we'll talk about. In the AG race, Mays Middleton beats Chip Roy. On the Democratic side in the AG race, Nathan Johnson beats Joe Jaworski by a pretty healthy margin as well. And in probably one of the only close races here relative, and it was close, Beau French edges out incumbent Wright in the Railroad Commission race. And then Vicki Goodwin wins easily in the lieutenant governor's runoff on the Democratic side. Not a lot of big surprises in the congressional and legislative races. One incumbent loses.
Yeah, I mean, Julie Johnson was kind of an incumbent too, I would say. I mean, it's kind of confusing because of the
incumbent versus incumbent. Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, I mean, and also you had Menifee and Green, and they're both Menifee was less of a Green than incumbent, but he was more of an incumbent in that district than Green was in a weird way. So that was the byproduct of the redistricting worked. If you just want to just jump to that for 1 second, which is that Julie Johnson, an incumbent, is removed from the House for Colin Allred, who wasn't the House before, in basically the same seat. Christian Menifee removes longtime incumbent Al Green. I mean, this was kind of the idea of all this. So to the extent that to the extent that mission accomplished for the Republican redistricting plan, like this was part of it. Part of it was getting more seats, but part of it was also putting these Democrats in these competitions against each other, and with the expectation the reality that only one could emerge.
Yeah, the asterisk on those incumbents largely won was the redistricting, that those were set up to be tough races for Democrats. So so it went. So where to begin? I mean, we have to begin with the Senate race, and we can talk about that. I would ask, you've probably been asked this, and I know I have, but were you surprised by the magnitude, the margin of the Paxton win?
I want to be honest, right? So I'm trying to be really reflective on it. And I think, I think it's easy in the aftermath to say no. I think he was probably going to, I would say this. The reason Paxton was in this race was because he had an advantage, and there was an expectation that Cornyn was going to have a hard time. There's a reasonable rationale we've talked about a lot that Paxton really has leaned into the types of voters who vote in Republican primaries and Republican runoffs. And so, I would say, if you said 55-45, I'd say, sure, but you're getting up close to 65, 2/3, that was a little surprising, but it's also the case that it's kind of hard to determine once Trump jumped in the way he did in the final, in the 11th hour kind of during voting. It's sort of hard to know exactly, what to make of this, I guess. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I would say I was, about like you were saying, I was expecting something, and again, I didn't know what to expect.
Yeah.
because for all the reasons we've talked about in terms of composition of the electorate and timing and turnout and all of that. I was expecting a comfortable Paxton win by this, but I would say I was, if not shocked, surprised by, this being a 20-something point race.
Yeah, I mean, you know, honestly,
I'd put it this way. I thought that Cornyn would be able to at least spend his way to a bit of a more dignified exit than he ultimately got.
Yeah, and I
I
think,
guess.
And honestly, my real gut reaction to this was, man, it's hard to poll in these runoffs, right? I mean, we've been talking about this all along, but I think one of the things is that, if you had been looking at some of the polling that had been kind of, more or less leaked, really, like aggressive, like intentionally leaked around this primary to kind of shape, what people should expect. I think the margins were generally a little bit closer. I mean, Paxton was generally up in most of those polling. Most of the polling that I saw,
I think the polling average was 10 or 11.
Yeah, and I think when you see that, my basic thinking is like, yeah, but this is a runoff. It's a Republican runoff. Do we expect, this? Do we expect the actual electorate that shows up to skew more conservative than the sample they could produce with all the techniques that are available at our disposal?
Yeah.
Or do we think it would be a little bit more moderate's not the right word, but just like less conservative? And there's always a good bet that it's going to be more conservative than you may even think, and especially in these sorts of low turnout races, which it still is a low turnout race. And so the fact that the conservative vote kind of expanded in that space is not surprising, I guess. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I guess when we think about it, when we talk about it that way, it triggers the, my, more airy-fairy, more abstract view of all this in some ways, which is like, I'm not sure what we mean by conservative anymore.
Well,
I mean, I know what we
yeah.
mean in a thumbnail sense, and I think it makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, if we were to look at, whatever self-identified ideology and all that, it's certainly pretty,
I would say, how about this?
It's definitely the case that whatever our conventional measures are, this electorate was expected to be more conservative and probably was. But I think we're also, I mean, it's still swimming around in my head that what we mean by conservative is and what people mean by conservative is probably shifting a bit in a way that we haven't quite got our heads around.
Yeah, what I should really say is it's probably filled with more people who have, more commitments, political commitments, and more extreme political commitments. How about that? We don't have to say exactly what direction is or put a whole wrapper around it. But I think that probably is what I would say is what these electorates represent. And, look, and Paxton has leaned into that. I mean, I think, one of the things that, I've been sort of telling people, I think, one of the, just to jump into this, one of the big sort of, I don't know, bias in the hot takes, right after this election has been that I think a lot of people are only focused on Paxton's, liabilities in a lot of cases and only focused on Tallarico's strength. And we'll get to this. I think that's kind of why I think the Republican machine has just, dumped the ads out immediately, because this kind of has been the focus coming out of it. But it is really important to acknowledge the fact that, at the end of the day, Paxton has experience running statewide, tons of experience. He knows how hard it is to campaign in Texas. He has now just, exited a very, very difficult primary. And sure, he has baggage from that, but he also has a lot more experience than does Tallarico. And that's kind of the thing here. Yeah, Tallarico has shown that he can raise a lot of money. He's raised a lot of money in the last few days since Paxton, claimed the nomination. He can earn some media, but that's not what campaigning in Texas is. Ultimately, it's going to be a grind that's going to be going on, obviously, as we can already see, for a long time. And, everybody who's doing the whole kind of, is Texas going to turn blue now, the usual kind of dance that comes up. It's like, and is Tallarico the vehicle? And my response to that is a big, big question mark here. Yeah. Is he the vehicle for this? We just don't know that.
Well, earlier in the day, I did this panel with, the people we've been rounding up for that: Mark Jones, Cromer Jeffers, Brad Johnson, Harvey Kromberg. And one of the things that came up in that it didn't come up in these terms, but as you mentioned, the statewide advantage, something that's interesting to consider in that is that when Paxton has had image problems in the past, and was running for re-election in Attorney General, which is part of what we assign as one of his advantages in terms of having statewide.
Absolutely.
But at that point, he had the luxury of kind of laying low. That once he got out of the primary, you didn't really hear much. And this is true of a lot of Attorney General candidates. It's not just Paxton, but I think it really served Paxton well and was deliberate that he was able to kind of lay low in those elections in a way that he's not going to be able to this time. And I don't think that obviates his, the advantages you're talking about, but it is a factor that I kind of had not been in the top of my mind until this conversation I had this morning that, Paxton can't really hide this time.
Yeah.
Now, he may not need to, and that's a separate question, but, his experience, I got to put it this way. His experience of running statewide is definitely, you'd rather have that than not.
Yeah. I think, and it speaks to the broader.
But it's a different kind of election this time for him.
That's right. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how he plays it. I mean, I think one thing that, if you just take a step back and try to just be, a neutral observer, I would say, he's handled this election pretty amazingly. I mean, people have asked it, I've gotten a lot of, I don't know if you've gotten this question a lot, but I've gotten the question like, what was the pivotal moment for you in the election or whatever, in this race in particular? And I always say, I think the move to kind of try to pressure the Senate on the Save America Act, it stalled Trump. It's a great demonstration of his fealty. And I mean, we'll see what the history books say about, did Trump already know he was going to support Paxton? And he was holding on to Cornyn's support in the Senate. That's a possibility. Or was this really just sort of a last minute thing? Did they see the data and then just say, no, forget it. Let's take some credit for this. I mean, we're just not going to know until, the history comes around.
If ever. Yeah.
Well, that's true, if ever. But it also just, speaks to the fact that, Paxton is an adept politician. And I've been, sort of, talking to a lot of people have started trying to figure out how does Paxton become the guy who fells, this quintessential Reagan Republican 4-term senator. And, part of it is that, his politicking is really good from what I can understand from people. Like his actual, retail politicking is apparently extremely good. But the other side of it is that, he's just, he's used the powers institutionally of his office. So, well, you're pointing out, like he can lay low if he wants, but he can also go sue anybody anytime he wants and do a press release and have it be covered and generate the kind of attention that has so far served him aggressively well in the primary. And I was just thinking about how hard it is for John Cornyn to combat that. I mean, even as a quote unquote incumbent, you're an incumbent in this institution that's like overwhelmingly maligned by everybody, right? When people are saying, like, the sort of big line that they kept using was like, well, what can you point to that John Cornyn has done for you, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, honestly, one of the biggest things he did, like just historically, recently, was move gun legislation forward, right? Like after the Sutherland Springs shooting, that everybody kind of considers to be, in some ways, one of his biggest betrayals that led to a lot of this talk about a primary challenge. But it also reflects the fact that you can't do this. You don't have that kind of power in the Senate to just make an action, drop a press release, and then say, here we go. But Paxton has just leaned into the use of the Attorney General's office to just create his own, political brand and persona that seems to kind of exist separately in a lot of ways, even probably from like Abbott. And I mean, they're not always on the same page on everything either. And so I just think, it's easy to sort of look at Ken Paxton and sort of line up all of the challenges that he faces, and they're real.
Yeah.
But I also think that it's really easy to forget about the fact that this guy knows what he's doing.
Right. There are assets that go with those liabilities.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, let's just, let's just talk about that a little bit. I mean, I think the dynamic that interests me on that is that on both the Republican and the Democratic side, and this is a, sociologically informed kind of thought, but, it seems like among political professionals and people that are, the super engaged, there's been a little bit of, illusions are dying hard, I think, on both sides. Right.
Yeah.
And on the Republican side, I think the most characteristic part of that, which you're plugging into here, I think really well, is, the idea that, surely our party cannot nominate Ken Paxton. Right. I mean,
yeah.
And that's a little bit unfair to some people, but I think there's a real vibe about that. and look, I mean, if the people out there,
Republicans are saying it.
I get it that there were some of you saying, "Oh no, I knew that, from the position of a more traditional quote unquote Republican that you might think, well, of course we are because things are going to shit." I know that attitude was out there. Right. But at the same time, I think there was a certain amount of like difficulty reconciling with the reality. And on the Democratic side, to kind of switch over to that a little bit, there's a certain sense of that with Tallarico, that because Tallarico could talk intelligently about Christian faith and in an informed way that, he could sustain, an infinite, I was going to say a couple hours of Joe Rogan, but really he's pretty deep on this. He can sustain an infinite conversation about this complete with, the receipts and the footnotes. But that ultimately led to a certain amount of faulty thinking among a lot of Democrats that was going to be enough to cement his, moderate or crossover, his moderate bona fides or his crossover appeal, to Texas people of faith. And I think that is going to, I could be wrong about this, but from what we're seeing right now, that really underestimated his liabilities.
Yeah. I think that's right.
And I should say campaign liabilities. I think somebody already leaned on me on this on social media or some other irrelevant place. But, the idea that just because you can enter an informed debate about Christianity, that all Christians or many Christians that might be a little discontented around the edges are going to go, you know what, that's okay, but you're still going to, and that's going to inoculate you against all the kind of attacks and the efforts to define Tallarico that we're seeing as we speak.
Well, I mean, the thing you described, like almost, perfectly encapsulates the stereotype, of kind of the liberal intellectual Democrat being like, well, he's Christian, so it should be fine. And it's like, right. Yeah, as we were kind of talking the other day, it's like, there's a lot of different kinds of Christians out there.
Yes, and often coming from people that probably could not sustain the discussion. Tolerate, no. People of a more decidedly secular bent, shall we say.
Yeah, exactly. And we know that's the polling data. And that's the other thing about all this too. I mean, I think I should just sort of put this out here is that, polling on religion is very complicated. And we do it. Other people do it. It's going on all the time. And there's questions in our survey about, religious denominations, about, sort of born again.
We actually
status.
have a lot.
we have a lot because we come from an academic background, and these are academically based questions that, we can use and compare to other, basically other surveys and other sources, and just generally other people will actually use this because it's sort of unknown and understood. But however, that doesn't mean that there isn't debate about this stuff. And when it comes to measurement, I will just say, as just a quick, wrapper for this, because we have to go into this.
Right.
Measuring faith is very complicated.
Right.
We can talk about some behaviors, we can talk about some loose ideas, but when it comes down to sort of actually uncovering people's faith and how that aligns or doesn't with organized religion, even the organized religions that they identify with, there are very few one-to-one matches through all this. And so that's just to say, it may seem like, well, Tallarico's a Christian. It's like, oh, okay.
When we put together a blog post for this website for this podcast, we'll put a couple of these, Tallarico favorability numbers by some of our religious measures.
Oh yeah,
and
exactly.
Whatever, however much we want to caveat that, those measurements, and I obviously totally agree with you on that. The patterns are still pretty clear when you look at those crosstabs.
Right.
That, biblical literalists are much less supportive of Tallarico than those who have a more secular view of the origins of and applications of the Bible, for example.
Now, this does raise an interesting question because we've already kind of brought this up, but I mean, the Republican effort to define Tallarico has wasted, literally like no time at all, just getting out there. And trying to sort of put some negative ads at it. And some of this was already going on. I mean, I think after the first round of voting, some Republican groups.
Absolutely. Yeah. Some super PACs were already softening him up.
Yeah. Part of that was for the good of the team. I mean, obviously, like Cornyn and Paxton just spent so much money eviscerating everybody. It's like, hey, let's remind Republicans what this is about. So that was going on. It's obviously, we've already seen the ads. I mean, the ads are being replayed like on cable news and stuff. So I mean, they're reverberating out beyond.
Well, I thought the Tribune had a slight bit of media observation. I won't call it criticism, but I mean, the Tribune headline today that was trying to be the story about, I think it was Tribune. I just want to make sure. Yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
That about the personal nature of this, and making a good point that each campaign is in a race now to define the other by their negatives.
I'm curious to see where you go with this. That's good.
Well, but the headline was Talafrico versus Ken the Criminal, I'm not sure I'm down with putting those attack lines in a headline. Very minor observation, but.
Well, look, I mean, Jim, the reality is
that story is right. And the reality it's talking about is, I think, utterly correct. But I don't.
Well, I don't know. I'm a little bit more suspect. I mean, we saw something from a CNN clip where they were kind of going through some of this stuff. They're using some more data, which is why, because, obviously that's all I care about. No, just kidding. But, we're watching this. No, I'm watching this and they're showing these ads. And I mean, look, here's the thing I think, we have to acknowledge here, which is that's a perfect headline for the Paxton campaign. I mean, you don't want your name, the criminal, put next to your name here. But to the extent that like all people are talking about is Ken Paxton's liabilities and his baggage, especially again in the aftermath of his nomination, if this becomes a race about, well, this is just a personal mudslinging battle and they both have, baggage, well, that's a win. Straight up, that's a win for Paxton. Like, I mean, the fact that that's already the conversation is fabulous for them because
that elaborates my objection much better than I already have. I mean,
once I was curious about where you're going with it, but that's like,
I mean, look, I mean, because I think the underlying dynamic and part of understanding, particularly, part of understanding the outcome of the runoff is that, as we've been saying for a few years now, for better or for worse, Paxton's liabilities are pretty baked in among his electorate.
Yeah.
If you know who Ken Paxton is,
right,
you have some inkling of his liabilities and you've incorporated that.
Yeah.
It's not the same with Talarico.
Yeah.
Because
and I think
Talarico is newer. I mean, it goes back to our who's run statewide and who hasn't.
Yeah, right. That's right.
So you're right. So I agree with you, and it's a better elaboration of what my seemingly kind of priggish objection to that. It is probably, thank you for giving more substance to my priggish objection, but is that it does, basically,
you're welcome, boss,
do work for the Talarico campaign or for the Paxton campaign that they would like done. And, kind of is out of balance in that sense. And look, they don't have to be perfectly balanced. And I would, this is a misdemeanor, not a felony. I'm not trying to.
But this is also campaigning.
But it is we're going to see a lot of this, as you say, by going to the CNN piece and all of that. It misses the asymmetry in this particular tactical battleground. Right. That, it looks like kind of a nuanced analysis, but it's actually missing some important things, it seems to me.
Yeah. And so I think that's the first thing. And then I think the question becomes, and I mean, look, I'm willing to go into the details. Like, there are qualitatively different criticisms that you're being leveled right now. I mean, one is like an Oppo, one is a straight Oppo research dump that's like, here's every, seemingly crazy thing we can find that he said that we have a video of. Whereas, the Ken Paxton thing, I mean, without even going down a list, I'd just say he was impeached by a Republican majority House for firing whistleblowers who have since been paid for being fired. Like, just set everything else aside. Like, I mean, there's a bunch of other stuff you could lead into or whatever. I don't care. Right. But just like, there's the idea that these are just sort of, he said, she says, it's one of these things, it's like, and it is and it is a very, Trump era whataboutism. It's like, oh yeah. Now here's the overarching thing. Does this matter? And if so, how? I mean, to your point, you said like a lot of the stuff about Ken Paxton is likely baked in amongst people who know him. And I would say, I agree with that, but I'd also say, baked in doesn't tell us whether it matters or not. Right. So for some people, it's baked in.
Or what circumstances it's going to matter or not. Right.
Right. And the thing is, and here's the issue is that for, most, what we would say is for most voters, their attitudes towards Ken Paxton are so overwhelmingly overdetermined. It doesn't matter. Like, for Democrats who have strong Democratic views, like Paxton's, ethical background is like just additional, whatever, right?
Right.
For Republicans who are, dyed in the wool, whatever, their Second Amendment, they're anti-abortion, they're like fully in the fold. They voted for Ken Paxton before, they'll vote for him again. The reality of his ethical challenges are kind of like, whatever, that's baked in, it doesn't matter. But the issue I think for Paxton we talk about is like, but for those people who, it matters in a different way, for those Republicans for whom it's a challenge, that's the challenge for them, right? As we're talking about in a turnout. The flip side of this, just going on to the Tallarico thing, is like
and that's where Tallarico in a headline helps.
That is where that helps to sort of, right? Exactly. It's a sort of to scare those voters into coming back.
Lest and not just forget what the bigger picture is here now.
Right. Don't just sit out. Don't just sit out. Come back. But the other thing I wonder about, and we'll just see how this plays out, and this will elaborate over time, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. But like, I just do wonder, whether there's not some danger in trying to paint Tallarico negatively vis-a-vis, opinions he's arrived at pretty directly from his faith, and that he's using the language of faith in order to advance. Yeah. I'm not like, and I'm like, I'm hesitant there. And I've seen the ads, like, I get it. But there's like two things about them that seem to me to be risky. One, again, is that, you're walking right up to his faith and almost making fun of him. And I think that's something you got to be pretty careful about in the Texas electorate, given what we've seen about the sensitivity of Christians to sort of being made fun of.
Feeling persecuted.
Yeah, exactly.
Or discriminated against, to use the precise language that we found in our polling.
Right. And so I think that's something that's just a little bit of a challenge. And the other one is more obvious, which is something we talk about all the time, which is, in an election environment, which voters are consistently telling us that they have problems with the economy, that they're falling behind, that they're concerned about prices, gas prices, grocery prices, housing prices, healthcare costs, is calling Tallarico a freak and kind of making fun of him, and the tone of it is really interesting because it's a little bit different than some of the past elections so far. It's like, is that serious enough to meet the moment? We're at war right now, by the way. Like, is that serious enough to meet the moments that we find ourselves in, or does it align with the way the voters see the moment? And that's still something we're just going to have to wait and see. But I think it's, it's pretty common to just say, look, the Democratic candidate is the most liberal person who's ever walked the face of the earth. Their views are insanely out of touch with Texas. And so therefore, and obviously, Tallarico makes that, they're kind of trying to do both. They're saying that a little bit, but they're also saying, he believes this version of Christianity that's just so outside of the mainstream. Yeah. But the flip side of that, I'll just say one more piece of this. The flip side is, does Paxton really want to have a debate with Tallarico over their faith?
Yeah.
I don't think
I think that is a trap that the Tallarico people are probably anticipating.
I think so.
And in terms of, flip side, and thinking about, whatever, different branching, possibilities, right, in terms of anticipating the debate.
Yeah.
And frankly, the literal debate.
Yeah.
Which I think we'll probably get at least one of.
I hope so. Honestly, I usually don't, but I can.
No, usually it's kind of, this time I feel like, this could tell voters something, put it that way. I don't want to chase too far down this rabbit hole because it's speculative. I guess you and I were talking about this differently. I guess I have a little more, I was going to say faith. I kind of think that the Paxton campaign can make a mistake here along the lines that you're talking about, that they could stray into, wait, are they just making fun of him because he's a Christian? Which I think is kind of sums up what you see as the possible red line there reasonably fairly. I just think they have a lot of room to run with that. Because there's enough sectarian, there's enough experience with sectarian Christian differences. Yeah. I think of the experience of somebody very close to me who grew up in rural Texas who, often dines out on the story of their kind of Baptist denomination throwing out a preacher and there being kind of a schism in this local small town church, over the sermons being too long and people getting beat to the buffet by the other church.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of quibbling that goes on here that gets pretty serious without people, but I think that's not wrong. I think your point is not wrong. It's just,
I love that
I think
story.
They have a lot of space for that.
That's just a beautiful story because we'll move on. But it's like, oh, so you're saying that like earthly matters still matter?
Yeah,
But, well, and also here in politics.
So so I don't know. So let's follow up on some of that a little bit and back up. And I mean, there are two big headlines kind of nationally and even locally, and I just kind of want to kick them both around.
Yeah.
Because I think both have some truth to them, but also are a little deceptive. Mm-hmm. The first is, and it's not just this race, it's also what happened in Louisiana, a couple other places nationally. And that is, this is pretty close to verbatim from the New York Times. Trump demonstrates tightened grip on GOP. And when you read that, I'm just wondering, like, I was kind of reflexively a little bit reticent to say that, even though there are parts of that that are obviously true.
It's funny that you bring that up, because honestly, I read that headline and I thought, I took a pause.
Yeah.
And I kind of decided how much I want to intellectually engage with that. And I thought, okay, fair enough. Like, I understand,
right.
In the broad context that is a very reasonable headline to write. And it is at least no doubt, I'll say this, it's certainly true enough, right? Which is to say that, regardless of what you think about whether or not Texas demonstrated a tightened grip on the GOP broadly, the reality of what happened in Texas in combination with the other races that we've seen before tightens his grip going forward with anybody else who has to consider a Republican primary at the very least. Right. So that's definitely true. I think the part that I was a little bit reticent about is the same one that you're a little bit reticent about, which is sort of like, how do we describe, explain, measure would be lovely, but almost impossible, handicap Trump's role in these results? Because it's all over it, but I mean, I find myself having to caveat just sort of, handing over the credit for it, because there's other things going on here, right?
Yeah. I guess what I think of, when I think of it's like, fair enough, I think about, discussions we've had and talking to other people about that, the fact that certainly in Texas, Trump's job approval ratings still in, low 80s, but the 80s.
Yep.
And kind of that's the comfort point for him across both administrations, more or less.
Yeah.
Where he settles after, contextual surges like, right after the election, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a pretty huge factor, right? On the other hand, that grip is tightest with the primary electorate, which certainly in Texas and in most states is going to be much smaller than the overall electorate.
Mm-hmm.
And, I kept struggling for a metaphor that I still haven't figured out, or, he's got a grip on something, but it's something that's, maybe shrinking a little bit, what does that tight grip, put it this way, that grip on the GOP means one thing in a primary election, but it's going to mean something entirely different in a general election. And it speaks to the dilemma that Republican candidates are going to have nationwide in an election in this structural point of the election trajectory, right? This midterm election, where you've got a party in the White House and they're at a disadvantage. And what does that grip really mean in September and October? Now, we don't know.
Right.
But it doesn't mean the same thing it means now.
Yeah. Well, look, it doesn't mean the same thing it means now. And the real question is, assuming as the electorate expands and his grip becomes less determinative of the outcomes, and we've been discussing, the question becomes, what do these nominated Republicans do? Because, the one thing that's sort of, one of the surprising things in some ways about the late endorsement of Paxton, right, to me, is that, Trump created a vacuum, right? He said he was going to endorse and he didn't endorse. And in that vacuum, the party, the elected Republicans largely in the Senate and their donors and the class of people who are largely funding these elections said, we are going to put our money on John Cornyn because we think he's a stronger general election candidate. That is the overt argument that they were making. They put $100+ million in, and then the voting starts and Trump says, I don't care, Pax. Now look, does that change the outcome? No, I don't think it changes the outcome at all. My read all along is he knew what the outcome was going to be with the data they had, and they said, okay, get some of this. But, he didn't have to do that. And by doing it, he really makes clear to the elites who are actually running the campaigns and raising the money that he doesn't care what their preferences are in this. It's only about his preferences, which he made very clear in the endorsement. It's about the loyalty to him and nothing else. So the question, I think becomes well, okay. The president has also said, he doesn't really care about the midterms. He's not really thinking about, people's personal finances. These are things that normally we would just say, historically, well, that's political suicide. But he's not up for re-election. And so how does this shake out? I mean, to your point, the thing that I keep kind of coming back to is in our last poll, it was almost 75% of independents disapprove of the job he's doing right now. 75. That's out of bounds bad.
Yeah.
Right. And so, if you'd ask me right now, can Republicans win in Texas with 80% support, 75% of independents against them, and 90+% of Democrats against them? I say, I don't know that they can. I mean, now again, that's not the numbers. Everybody's doing a lot of simple back of the envelope math right now. I think it's super sketchy, and I just want to throw that out there because everything's conditional on everything else. But the other thing I think is interesting to this is you go down the ballot, right? And so Trump endorses Paxton. He has this huge victory. Obviously, he would like to take a lot of credit for that. And we were kind of talking about how much of that is Trump boosting Paxton, how much of that is the bottom falling out of Cornyn. Because what's the, there's sort of what's the point here? Right. But also you had Mays Middleton win by about 10 points, again, against a candidate who had clearly had differences with the president, open differences. In his case, it's unlike Cornyn, actually kind of leaned into it a little bit and said, hey, you get an independent voice here. Mays Middleton spent a ton of money to make himself MAGA Mays Middleton. I mean, if anybody outside Texas knows who Middleton is, the president say MAGA Mays, that's what it is. And he didn't have the same, sort of expansive win. You look at Beau French down there, the Railroad Commission race. Right. And this is the other piece of this,
which is the only close one.
Well, what's interesting about this one, just in the overall thing that
the major races,
that maybe, you can react to a little bit is that, there's another piece of this, which you've got Trump on the one hand, you've got sort of Republican elites. I was talking about the Senate level on the other, but you've also got Republican elites in Texas and the party, sort of the natural, resource giving entities in Texas really aligned behind Wright, especially in the final weeks. I assume they saw bad data and really tried to push him with a ton of money, and it failed.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, your point, you said this earlier, conservatism, what does that mean? But I'm thinking about the overall primary now that we're sitting here and you think about, the victories that, Abbott and his group were able to achieve. They were able to sort of move Sid Miller off. The ones they weren't, they've got Don Huffines on the ballot, right?
Yeah.
You've got Beau French, clearly, the elites in the party did not want on the ticket because of all the controversies among other things. He's on the ticket. You've got, Paxton and Cornyn, again, the betting money was that Cornyn was the safer candidate. Well, you got Paxton on there now. And it's sort of so who's in control of what is actually a sort of a bigger question maybe than just even Trump's control on the slice of the Republican primary electorate.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of that is just a structural effect that we're, honestly, I think we're going to need a political universe with Trump not in the White House to really figure out what the weight in front of the Trump factor is.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
We know it's heavy. We know it's heavy in a primary environment. There's no pussyfooting around that. And our intermediate check-in on that will be the midterm, in which we see how Republican candidates at the statewide level in particular, or at the state level, I should say, navigate this dilemma, which, simply put is, you're going to have some incentives in a general election where you may think you need some persuadable voters to calibrate your closeness to Donald Trump.
Right.
In response to an issue environment that is not in your favor.
Yeah.
And I just think, obviously, as we keep saying, I don't think the particular math of that is going to become very reliably apparent before September anyway, probably.
Yeah.
Maybe August. Yeah. But in the meantime, that's an uncomfortable position to be in. Mm-hmm. And I think that does feed back on the why, if you're a Republican right now, you want this election to be about a couple of things. You want it to be about James Tallarico and his ideological profile as Republicans define it. Mm-hmm. And you want it to be about something as yet undetermined that is not the national economy and not Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Without complete, keeping that other consideration in mind that, you can't, you don't want to, nor can you renounce Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. But, and I've said this a couple of times as we've talked about it, I think, what you want to find is a way to focus this on Texas, if you're a Texas candidate, to the exclusion of as much of the national stuff as possible.
Yeah, which is going to be a real challenge.
No, I think it is, unless, the economy stages a miraculous recovery between now and then.
Yeah, which I think just given the structural stuff seems almost impossible.
Just seems very difficult. They could open the Strait of Hormuz tomorrow,
and still it wouldn't.
Necessarily, it's not going to happen soon enough, and that's not going to happen anyway. So
right.
Yeah. So what else? In terms of I want to talk a little bit about you kind of brushed up against this.
Yeah.
Kind of the internal alignment, and it's still a little soon to talk about this. I kind of threw this out there at the Pat thing, and I got some response, but not. But there's an interesting dynamic here, and I shouldn't say that. We got some response, but I don't want to poison the well here too much. But
that's okay. I'll say anything. Go ahead.
But look, I'll try. I just had Harvey Kromberg and Brad Johnson on the same panel, so there was a lot of range. But I
was going to say something else.
I guess what I'm trying to figure out here is, or what I'm mulling here is, when this is all over, in mid-November, and then we all are looking at January. Mm-hmm. What is the impact and the sense of alignment in the 10 square blocks or 5 square blocks around the Texas Capitol? Because the odds on bet right now is that you're going to have 2 significant executive branch elected offices in the comptroller and the attorney general. Again, playing the odds, everybody should go out and vote for their candidate. But if it turns out that you've got Controller Huffines and Attorney General Middleton, you've got 2 former state senators fairly closely aligned with, broadly speaking, the Patrick faction, and one of whom has, kind of a borderline history of blood feud with the governor.
Yeah.
In the controller's office, should it come out that way. And possibly, I think, in all likelihood, a somewhat smaller Republican caucus in the House.
Yeah, reasonably to expect.
Maybe by a couple, maybe by more,
Yeah.
Depends on, again, what things start looking like. And, what does this portend for the politics that we've seen in the last few sessions in terms of alignment between, Patrick and Abbott, alignment between the House and the Senate? Who's got allies where in the, who in the executive branch has allies where in the legislative branch? And I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah.
But I do think it's a pretty interesting dynamic if you're focused on legislative politics and what's going to happen starting next January.
I add to that list, something just from before, which is, without the unifying, because the unifying vector of Donald Trump over everything. I mean, he was a pretty big factor in the last legislative session to the extent that he acts as some kind of a, unifier, guardrail, stick, carrot, whatever. He was,
a looming presence.
Yeah, a looming presence. But that if you remove that, something that you already mentioned this, but it's really interesting to think about, because just as someone who's interested in political science and all this stuff, I think it's really interesting to think about what emerges in the post-Trump era in terms of sort of the ideological definition and makeup of both parties. Honestly, it's not just the Republicans; it's actually both parties, 100%. And that's actually, a really interesting thing, because to your point, I think Ted Cruz probably has an idea. It might be different than his potential soon-to-be colleague, in the Senate, and I just don't know. And I think that's, I'm thinking to you're really talking about the agenda in a lot of ways, but I was thinking, about some big areas where there's, property taxes is a huge area where there's a lot of disagreements amongst those groups about how
public disagreement between the lieutenant governor and the governor has laid down some threats and red lines.
Yeah, the data center thing is I think going to be huge, because they're spending so much money on politics right now. Just the AI industry. Texas has this kind of, mythical projection of itself, or reality, as this open, friendly place. If you live here, we are in Austin. There are self-driving cars just going everywhere. Constantly, you're building the data centers. But if you know anything about the history, the tax breaks those data centers are getting were considered, the volume and the size of them were considered very problematic recently in other industries. So that's an open question. And so that's this sort of, there's a local control. There's a bunch of stuff going on there, and it actually is going to have a lot of business interests and a lot of money going in various directions. I just, who knows? So that's interesting. There's just a lot of stuff like that. And even so, Trump's still in the White House, so they can't really focus on immigration, and the border is like this scourge they have to, essentially, prioritize. So it's a good question. I don't know what that's going to look like. As you said, the alignment internally is just so much.
Yeah, it's a little more opened up, I think. And I think what we're seeing is, the exacerbating of familiar cross currents. None of this is particularly new, but I think, it does have the potential to reshuffle the deck a little bit. And there's also the factor of, so again, assume the highest probability outcome, both Dan Patrick and Greg Abbott are reelected. Mm-hmm. There's still a Republican majority in the House, and the Senate, of course. But, the day after the election, the speculation will be running rampant about whether this is the last term for both Paxton and Abbott.
Yeah.
They are not going to come out and announce that, but I'd be more surprised if each of those guys ran again than if they didn't.
Well,
and so there's an interesting lame duck dynamic there with two people in Middleton and Huffines that are probably not eyeballing finishing out their careers in the offices that they will be in should they win those races.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
Again, it makes my stomach hurt a little just to project out into the next election.
Right.
But I think, if you're talking about the consequences here, this is one of them.
Yeah. No,
one of the things to be, and right now it's more like things to watch than it is anything we can know definitively right now. We're still.
Yeah. And
finally being through these primaries and having the runoffs done, we're at a little bit of a reset or, a threshold into the next phase.
Yeah, I think it's a good point to raise. I think, the seams were already coming undone just a little bit, even prior to all the primaries. You see these instances between Abbott and Paxton over, who had the authority to kind of do what, especially around the quorum break. And that was really kind of an open, hey, this is and it was one of the few times I actually seen them kind of openly just
even more recently on the, one of the, sort of anti-Islamic flare-ups.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. And so they're kind of shoulder-reaching.
They're going to argue about that. They will argue about anything.
Right. Exactly.
So what else? big picture, and, again,
Yeah.
I will issue our usual joint caveat about overinterpretation and then invite you to overinterpret.
Please.
What is, in this pause now, what do you think about like where each of the parties is? I mean, look, on one hand, we know that both parties are kind of suffering in terms of general approval ratings.
Yeah.
Along with other institutions, probably nobody more than Congress, which I think is an interesting kind of aspect of all this. But, can we take anything from this? I mean, look, this goes back a little bit to the, I said two headlines, and, we kind of went off on the Trump has a grip. The other headline that speaks to the point I want to talk about here is, is this the moment of the definitive transition of the Republican Party from the, and again, this is the overinterpretation part, from the party of John Cornyn to the party of Ken Paxton? Not that they are the leaders, et cetera, but, because on one hand, you and I wrote a couple of weeks ago, hey, the obvious has been kind of staring us in the face here for a while. Ken Paxton is probably a better representation, not just of the far right of the party, but of the median voter maybe in the Republican Party.
Yeah.
Maybe, right? We didn't put it that way. That's a little more committed than we were. Yeah. But that certainly, Paxton channels the Republican Party circa 25, 26 a lot more than John Cornyn does.
Yeah.
And then, the issue of Tallarico and what, where the Democrats are on this. Nominated somebody in this kind of schizophrenic view that he's both, a young new generation Democratic progressive, and he's got crossover potential. So, general kind of morning afterthoughts on where the parties are here.
To you, the way you set that up, I don't know that I'm ready to say that, Ken Paxton is a sign of what comes next any more than I'm ready to say that Tallarico is, right? Or anybody at this point, because I think it's so wild. But I will say, a little bit less, sexy. It is the death of the Reagan Republicans, right? Like the idea of like this certain quarter, like I think about McCall, I think about, Cornyn, and you think about these guys who, over the last couple of cycles have filtered out of the party. And some of that's generational, but it's also, it's also honestly dispositional. Some of the things we think about, the U.S.'s place in the international order and all that stuff is changing dramatically. And a lot of the people who are really held a different position on that stuff are either retiring or being, pushed out of office. And so, I don't know what comes next. And I don't know if Ken Paxton is the vehicle for that. I'm a little reticent to go that far, and part of that's just because I don't think that, we already talked about this, I just don't think that there's a real clear path right now for either party that I think is exactly clear, right, in terms of what, the ideology looks like. And that's what one of the things I've been asked a lot, and we've sort of talked about this a little bit, is, is this like a big anti-incumbency moment? And I'm like, well, look, you could say that, and this captures some of this, right? But to me, that's not it. It's like, there's some anti-incumbency because, look, being incumbent sucks. If you're part of Congress, you can't do anything, and you're really more engaged in partisan conflict than in actual policy making. So you can't come back to your voters and say, "Hey, look what I did for you." You can say, "Hey, look at my tweet, or look at my TikTok, or see what I did to this guy. See how I owned fill in the blank," right? And that is what it is. But it's just not the sort of thing that makes an incumbent like ironclad, like a school or a new water treatment plant or whatever it is that your constituents actually want and need. And so I think there's that challenge just for all incumbents. There is a generational issue here. Like these guys are old. Cornyn's old. A lot of the people in the Democratic Party who are being pushed out are very old, and there is a generational change coming on. But the third piece of it is this exact thing, which is, but what is next? Like what is going to be the thing that's going to animate voters of the right leading party and voters of the left leading party in the 21st century right now? And it's kind of like, and we already see these conflicts. Like I think the Maha movement is an interesting where you see these sort of crossover kind of stuff. The foreign policy space is another situation where you've seen a lot of sort of crossing over in terms of sort of where the ideological lines are supposed to be. Yeah, there's less partisan sorting on those issues. And AI is gonna. I think, and I'm not like I'm like the last person to be the AI is changing everything, as you know. But I do think there is an aspect to this where the reactions of business and labor to changes that come about in response to AI is going to create frictions on both sides. We're already seeing it. I mean, we're already seeing if you're a Democrat who took if you're a Democrat who's a crypto money or data center money or whatever, it's like it's like a question now whether they should be suspect. I mean, it's not clear whether Democrats are suspicious.
We're seeing little peaks of that, the way that the crypto money thing became an issue in the Menifee Green congressional race.
Yeah, and I think on the right, I said this whole data center thing is interesting because it's like you're not like they're not trying to put a data like we live in Austin because we work at the University of Texas. No one's trying to put a data center next to my house because it's too damn expensive. The real estate's too much, the taxes are too much, so they're putting it in the places where it's not, and those tend to be rural communities, those tend to be exurban, those tend to be places largely represented by Republicans, and this sort of broadly pro-business growth, mindset versus the realities of the fact that Texas does have limited resources. Sorry, we do have a limit on our water, we do have a limit on our energy, and so that's just the reality. And I don't think the Republicans don't have an answer to that yet either. So all of this is like it's very interesting so long as you're not scared by it all.
And look, I mean, there's an inherent fear factor here that comes from change.
Well, anxiety is fear of the unknown. And to the extent like nobody knows what's coming next in a lot of different spheres right now. There's a lot of, really generational transformations going on. And I don't love to throw that out because everybody says that, well, this is the most important election that ever happened, blah, blah, everything's the most important thing ever. You're the most important person to ever live, blah, 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 blah. But like, there's a lot going on in this moment, both, politically, ideologically, the information environment, communications, work, the list goes on and on. So, not surprisingly, the politics is reflecting a little bit of that.
Yeah. And I'm just curious to see as we get closer to where people are paying attention, there's going to be a lot of, speaking to mobilized constituencies and attentive potential voters throughout the summer. And I'm curious to see where that is all going to land, because I think that, the strategies of the two campaigns are, as of now, the two Senate campaigns and what the parties are going to do. I mean, their choices seem to me at this moment, in broad terms, relatively clear, right? You've got Republicans looking for an agenda that will mobilize their voters without alienating too many crossover voters. And I think Republicans are at this moment in the professional class, mindful of the fact that they might have turnout challenges. And we talked about that, I think, in last week's podcast or the week before. And that's there. And so right now there are two things going on. I mean, the security blanket, as we've said, and it's necessary, and it reflects the lessons of 2018, and that they kind of let better or work get out of the gate.
Yeah, they're not
oversimplified, right? And that's not happening this time.
No,
right.
Absolutely
and
not.
So pretty clearly, anybody that's listening to this knows what I mean by that, probably. But look at the anti-Talarico ads being run by the super PACs right now. And as you said earlier, that started months.
It's not even summer,
right? And so that is pretty clear. That's the negative part of the campaign. I guess I'm still trying to figure out, and I think the Republicans are still trying to figure out where the positive part of that campaign is going to be. And not like the campaign has to have a positive tone per se, but you can't win just by defining and attacking the other guy. I think it's necessary at the Senate level, and it helps the Republican ticket overall if you can identify Democrats with this construction of Talarico as, all these negative things that they're throwing out there. But what is the proactive part? And I think one of the things that, the comments you were just making about data centers and growth and all that is that, there's a little bit of a problem with what has been the classic mobilizing positive messaging of most of the Abbott era, even reaching back into some of the Perry period. But certainly the Abbott era, which is, Texas is on the move. We're growing, whatever else is going on out there, we're good here. I'm curious to see how they are going to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying they don't have anything to work with. They can, say, we lowered your property taxes and we're going to do more. We're going to see that. But and again, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's going to be an interesting space to be in. And the summer, I think, is going to be watching trial and error and trial balloons with that, which is very much very much an insidery nerd kind of game. But I do think that's what we're going to see this summer.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there's going to be probably more trial balloons this summer than we're even used to seeing because of the challenges that Republicans are facing. One national reporter posited something to me that I thought was interesting because I hadn't really thought about it this way. And she was saying, did I think that the Save America Act and sort of voter integrity broadly would be an issue that Paxton would carry into the general? And she was mentioning that, being in Washington's like Trump talks about all the time. Like it just gets dropped all over the place. He wants it. And, I think as we already said, that's part of the reason that Paxton's probably in this position, at least partially, was, his latching onto that and saying that he would, definitely be a fighter for that. And I was, she said, is that an issue he runs on in Texas in November? And I was thinking, that's an interesting question. I told her that's a good question. And when you think about it, that would be a comfortable way for Paxton to pivot towards a more traditional Republican issue in the general that, again, it's not talking about the economy, but it's talking about, look,
21st century traditional. Yeah.
21st century traditional. Yeah. And he could say, look, hey, and look, he's going to the Senate. And this, to your point, I think there's something to point to not share, which is, his agenda in terms of what the campaign looks like, and Abbott and Patrick and those guys at the state level are likely to look pretty different. I mean, Abbott and Patrick are going to want to insulate themselves from whatever's going on and say, hey, thank God we're not everybody else. I could see Paxton say, hey, we're doing it right here in Texas. We've been tackling this voter fraud problem. We've been making changes. And you know what? I got to go to the U.S. Senate to bring this to America so that our elections are safe. So we have real representation, which honestly, an election where the polls are going to show most likely overwhelming Democratic support in trial ballots, both individually and generically, you can see how that would be a solid mobilizing argument for Republicans to at least get their base to show up, which in Texas is the main thing that they're trying to do here at this point.
I also wonder, along those lines, if part of the fallout of the terms in which they are seeking to negatively define Tallarico out of the mainstream in terms of Texas cultural politics, which is kind of, everything from, he believes in 6 genders, quote unquote, to, he has this kind of screwy brand of Christianity.
He's a vegan, for God's sakes.
Yeah, he's a vegan, and probably even more telling and interesting, this assault on his masculinity, which is also
very interesting
to be a whisper campaign about his gender identity and all of this, right?
Right.
Is that, how defining is that going to be of the pot in terms of the proactive part of the campaign? Are they going to let that sit and say, well, do you want this? Or do you want somebody who's going to, kind of the argument you making?
Yeah.
Or as, you're sort of suggesting they might do, and they'll do all of it. But how tightly are they going to bind their promotion of Paxton to the negative stereotypes? Are they going to use that, drive his negatives up, but then talk in more to kind of, more traditional terms about, and I'm going to go to Washington and support the Republican agenda and, bring some of the great stuff we've done in Texas to the country, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question about what the relationship is going to be between those two components.
Well, and I think
I don't know, but.
Well, and it's inherently challenging, but I think what you're also describing, is, it's interesting. Look, this is something that, people have been saying, have also, so does this mean Texas is competitive? And the answer is, Texas is competitive. There's no, and part of this is what you're describing in a lot of ways is, Paxton needs to figure out which needle to thread given a difficult election environment in order to maximize Republican turnout.
Right.
And I just was saying, like, the idea that, like, the goal here is a blowout, I don't like, that's not the election we're looking at right now. But here the question is, can you get enough voters to show up to get you across the finish line alone with that? And I think that's going to be, gearing a lot of Paxton campaign. I think the challenge in some ways is something I brought up before, which is, is that going to work for everybody else on the ticket?
Right.
And that's going to be a little bit, I think their incentives are a little bit different. They don't have his baggage.
And this came up in the last Pat thing, to give people credit, but I mean, I think it's out there, which is that, but I think the fallout of that is if Paxton takes a sort of every man for himself approach to this, right? Which is, all I got to do is get over.
Right.
Right. If he just gets over, then that is going to have negative consequences down ballot. Right. How negative or not, but I mean, if Paxton only wins, say Paxton wins by the O'Rourke-Cruz margin.
Yeah.
Well,
I guess what I
lost a lot of, lost a handful of seats that session, and it had, to go back to our earlier discussion, that had consequences for the agenda in the 2019 legislature.
Yeah, I think, gaming that out is complicated because the flip side of that is, do you think in an election like that where Paxton ekes it out, I would suspect that Abbott is going to have a better margin for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
And so then the question becomes, what is the erosion point from? Where do we start? Do we start at Paxton's number? Do we start at Abbott's number? And also further, really in some ways the question becomes, even if we assume that, like, we're assuming a lot of things. We assume Paxton wins. We assume Abbott wins. Assuming that Abbott outperforms Paxton, which I think is a pretty safe assumption, how much of a drag on Abbott is Paxton, and therefore how much is that and drag on the overall margins going down? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and one of the things we know for sure is that, the Paxton people are not going to be in charge of the Texas campaign.
Nope. Yeah.
Exactly. And, as I've been, trying to point national observers to, you really need to, pay attention to what Greg Abbott has been doing, what the Abbott campaign has been doing, and pay attention to what they're doing during the summer if you can get anybody to talk to you.
Yeah. The thing I'm going to watching there is, how does Representative Inosa convince donors that they're not just burning money by donating to her campaign? And I don't mean to be mean, but like Abbott's got so much money and he's so much more well known, and he can bury her. If he wanted to bury her today, he could bury her, but he would just raise her name ID. So he's not like,
and I think, who knows, but an interesting dynamic about that is that it will be interesting to see. And this is one of those things that will be hard to actually find out. But what I would predict, given the history of relations between the principals here, is that there will be some subtle and some not so subtle appeal to donors by the Abbott folks going, look, if we're going to save what we got here, we're going to do it. You cannot rely on Ken Paxton, to define what is going to happen in the Republican campaign in Texas. Obviously, it's going to matter, but, you need to make sure that we get the money to do that. And I think, that has two virtues. One, just as we always show, has the virtue of probably being true in the sense of who's got the more competent campaign organization from a partisan perspective, but also it plays on, probably the Republican elite disappointment in the fact that it's Paxton and not Cornyn.
No, that's a brilliant observation. I'm going to say one thing. I want to ask you one more question, then we should wrap up probably. But, I think that's a great observation because, and that also speaks to the whole federal state campaign finance dynamic, right? Which is that, donors who want to keep Texas red can only give directly to Paxton so much. They can do super PACs and do other things. But if you really want to make sure Texas stays red, it's a really great time for Abbott to go to those exact same donors who just wrote their $3,500 check and say, hey, why don't you write me a $350,000 check and I'll make sure this is cool.
Right.
And it's a great time for Abbott to be looking for investors because there are a lot of people out there who are going to be unsure that Paxton's the vehicle for this or that they want to just dump a bunch of money in there. And I think the other piece of this is that knowing that Abbott is likely to not have to spend a lot of money on his actual own direct campaign, that money just becomes
right
spread out throughout the party.
Relative to the money he will have. Yes.
Let me ask you one more question, and then I think we should probably wrap this up, which is, so, you're the Paxton campaign.
Yeah.
You want Trump to come to Texas for you?
Yeah, I think you do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You take it?
I think the timing
okay.
is probably going to matter.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end, look, and again, put it this way, if Trump's numbers stay where they are among Republicans, you want Trump to come to Texas for you.
There you go.
What do you think?
Look, the last time
that could change, but
look, from my recollection, the last time he came to Texas during a close election, the data indicated that it was a net negative for Republicans. And his numbers were better then than they are now.
Yeah.
So, there's sort of this question of, had Cornyn won, did he want Trump's endorsement? He'd take it, but he's not going to deny it. It just sort of is what it is at that point. No. But there's a difference between that and, Trump coming and holding a big, beautiful rally in Tarrant County or whatever. I think that that's a net negative for him, because I don't think that Paxton really needs that much help. I'll say this: Paxton will have help mobilize Republicans from Abbott and from the rest of the ticket in a way that I think Trump actually complicates for him. But we'll see. And I don't know.
Yeah, I think that will be a judgment about where Trump's numbers are when that decision has to be made.
Yeah,
and what the dynamics are with Trump. They may not want him to come, and Trump may tell them they need him, and they may not actually have much of a choice about it.
I keep thinking about the decision to go to war. It's and then what?
Yeah, but I do think, based on where we are right now, this plugs into this conversation that's been going on. Mm-hmm. I think if Republicans are still perceiving an enthusiasm and turnout problem on their part, and Trump's numbers have not dropped below 80 among Republicans,
right?
They kind of got to roll the dice and have him come.
Yeah, and it is a roll of the dice.
Because look, the counter-mobilizing effect is the counter-mobilizing effect of Trump. And I don't think put it this way, I think him coming, whatever, to the extent that it might raise the bar in both the counter-mobilization and the mobilization, it's probably, given the predicates I talked about, still a net gain in mobilization.
Yeah.
Again, depending on where Trump's numbers are in the fall.
There's so many things going through my head right now. I don't want this to be another podcast. I'll leave it. Interesting.
Yeah, when we get closer. So
yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for being here, Josh.
Of course.
And for putting up with me being late. Thanks a lot to always our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin, who helped engineer remote recording today so I don't infect everybody around me with this chest cold. Most of all, thanks to all of you for listening. You'll find supporting data, much more on all of this on our website, texaspolitics.utexas.edu. And if you're still listening and you're somebody kind of in the fold in Texas government and politics, I also want to remind you that we have an internship bulletin board. A lot of kids looking for internships now for the summer and for the fall. You can post your position at that site for free. The site gets hundreds of thousands of users a year. I can almost guarantee you that you will get some resumes and some good applicants. So please, if you go to texaspolitics.utexas.edu, click on internships, you'll find a link to a very easy to use form that reaches a lot of people. Conversely, a young person who's looking for internships, point them to this resource. Again, not something you have to pay for. It's a public service of University of Texas and the Department of Government here at UT Austin. So I would point you to that resource. So plug completed. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.